blessed good morning to all. Trusting that you had a beautiful night. Our theme for this week is looking at where Christ shows up in our lives on a daily basis. Being deliberate in looking for those times, acknowledging those times, and making the most of those times, because the Christ does show up when we become aware. When we're not aware, we would figure that the Christ does not show up. But when we walk with awareness, we're actually able to recognize the Christ's presence in our lives. And so this week, we are reflecting on that and seeking to find ways to acknowledge this in our lives so that we're able to benefit from this wonderful presence. So this morning again, as we turn our attention to our time of devotion, we do so with this theme in mind. Where does the Christ show up in my life? Where does the Christ show up in my life? Come into that quiet place and breathing into our heart space. Breathing with awareness. Breathing with a spirit of thankfulness and gratitude. Allowing ourselves to find that quiet place, that spot within us, a place of inner peace, stillness. That source of light. Just feeling that presence. And breathing with awareness. Being conscious of every breath. Being conscious of everything that is around us. The place we're standing or sitting or lying. Whatever it is that is supporting us, holding us up. Allowing ourselves to feel that sense of expansion. It is amazing how when we go within and we focus on that inner place, that we all of a sudden feel much larger than our physical bodies. It is as though our consciousness bypasses the physicality and taps into something different, something more expansive, our real, total being. So let's be in that space for a while. Even as we turn to a scripture and hear what Spirit is saying to us in this day. Hearing what Spirit is guiding us to receive at this time. Jesus went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee, and was teaching them on the Sabbath. They were astounded at his teaching because he spoke with authority. In the synagogue there was a man who had the spirit of an unclean demon, and he cried out with a loud voice, "Leave us alone. What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. But Jesus rebuked him, saying, Be quiet and come out of him. Then the demon, throwing the man down before them, came out of him without doing him any harm. They were all astounded and kept saying to one another, What kind of a word is this, that with authority and power he commands the unclean spirits, and they come out? And news about him began to reach every place in the region. Is it not amazing that you wonder about this gift of the Christ in our world, and you often recognize the beauty of Jesus' presence in our lives. And our theme this week is speaking about the importance of really recognizing the Christ. Where does the Christ show up in our lives? And this passage that I would have just shared with you is a really interesting passage, because here is Jesus walking amongst persons, doing various deeds, signs, wonders, giving powerful teaching. And persons aren't sure who he is. Persons aren't convinced about who he is. They go so far as to ask, what kind of word is this? They are amazed, but they don't get beyond their amazement to anything that is concrete. Yet, the unclean demons, according to the gospel writer, asked Jesus why he has come and if he is here to destroy them. They recognize him, they know who he is. And they're the unclean demons. But the people of God, the people that are around, the people that he's ministering to, don't seem to be able to recognize him. What blocks the people from seeing that doesn't block the demons from seeing? What is it that causes us not to be able to recognize the Christ presence in our world? Is it our own ego? Is it that little self of ours that seeks to, in every respect, declare its importance? That ego that refuses to acknowledge that there is a greater power? You know, all through the ages, men have perceived themselves as gods. Not in terms of their extending the divine reality, but that they're gods in and of themselves. They are superior. And they act it out. And they have acted it out. And those who don't have the power or that position are so jealous of it that they themselves pretend in their own little world to have that power, to be gods. And so, in a sense, we're all full of ourselves, full of this little self who believes itself to be the king of all kings. And that is what causes us not to be able to perceive the Christ. Because our little selves seek to sit upon the throne of the divine. The divine self is usurped, and the little self pretends to be in control. It pretends because it itself is not real. So anything it does can only be pretense. Hence why Jesus had so much power over them. Because Jesus knew that they were not real. Jesus knew that they had no power. Jesus knew that they were pretend. He knew this. And because he knew this, he was able to tell them to come out. The presence of the Christ is destructive to the unclean demon. Because the Christ is real. And the image has no power over reality. When the real is present, the image cannot be there. The image is unreal. The self that we pretend to be cannot be around when our true self manifests. When Jesus calls out the unclean spirit, in a sense, Jesus is more so calling the man into his right mind. So when the man comes into his right mind, no other mind can be present. The man comes back to himself. And whatever that was must disappear. That is how I would perceive it from the 21st century. When we take back our power from the ego, we are then in our right mind. And our ego must take its place. The Christ shows up when we are in our right mind. When we are not being governed by our small self. When we are not being dictated to by our little selves. When we are not being fooled that we lack by our little selves. When we are not being misled by our little selves that other persons are more important than we are. When we are in our right mind, we know differently. And when we know differently, we behave differently. And when we behave differently, there's no place for the unclean demon. The spiritual path is that of coming to one's right mind and living from that place and knowing that nothing can touch you when you are in your right mind. When we live otherwise, we are at the mercy of every thought, of every emotion, of every wind that passes. And the more we allow ourselves to be at that mercy, the weaker we become. And the more difficult it is to really redeem or recover our true self. But our right-mindedness is still there. Our true self is still there. And all that is needed is assistance to help us to come back to our right mind. And then we will see. When the two disciples were on their way to Emmaus, they were so filled with grief. They were considering that they had all these plans for Jesus. The plans were very small plans. The plans were plans based on the ego. The plans were plans that they figured was the way forward. They were disappointed. All of their intentions had gone to nothing. They were caught up in their own little demonic space. And by demonic, I mean their egoic space. So consumed were they by that space, that egoic space, that when Jesus came along and started to speak with them, they could not recognize him. They were too much within their egoic space. They spoke afterward of their hearts burning, of that divine presence within, that divine core that they are. They recognized that at a point in the conversation, there was something in them that began to burn. So that by the time they got to table to break bread, that divine spark, that right-mindedness had come into play. And they could see. What of you? What of me? To what extent are our plans and our ideas and our concepts and our ideologies being like unclean demons, blocking the path, blocking us from our right-mindedness? And they know, to some extent, that dimension of ourselves knows, but pretends and fools us into thinking that we are something else. But by the grace of God, and by our doing our inner work, looking beyond that little self, that little jealous self, that little greedy self, that little self that wants it all, by doing the work, by letting go of that need that we are being fed, that little self, we can begin to feel our hearts burning. And as the burning expands, we can begin to recognize the Christ presence, the larger picture, the larger purpose, the greater plan. This is the task that stands before all of us, to be able to move beyond the dimension of the smaller self and to become right-minded, so that the divine can fully manifest and we can present ourselves fully as we are intended to be, and then journey from that place of right-mindedness. When Jesus commanded the unclean demon to come out of the man, it came out without doing any damage to the man.